Mentorship isn't only about what the mentee can learn. In fact, Barbara Adachi believes that it should be a two-way street. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. On this show, we share perspectives from leading corporate directors and discuss what makes boards effective, how they can help companies face challenges today, and become future-ready. In this episode, Barbara Adachi, a board member at Atlas Technology Solutions, Old Republic International Corp., and VSP Vision, joins Lori Mackenzie, co-founder of the VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab at Stanford University, and advisor to August Public, in a conversation with Raquel Suarez, NACD Senior Manager of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, in a discussion about the role of mentorship in the boardroom. They explore what defines an effective mentor-mentee relationship, whether and how to formalize mentorship programs, and how mentees, mentors, and the board can benefit from the engagement. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Barbara and Lori, tell us about your mentor relationship and how it all began, who initiated the relationship, and how has it grown?
This is a question that's actually tough to answer because Barbara and I have such a deep and rich relationship that it's hard to remember when and how it started. But for sure, it started when I was executive director of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford. And Barbara agreed to be an advisor to the Institute. And it was such a thrill to meet somebody who had such deep experience in the human capital space and in the nonprofit space, and whose stories I really wanted to listen to. And for me, that was the beginning of our mentor-mentee relationship.
Lori, thank you so much for sharing that. I would agree. I think I met Lori very briefly at Women's Initiative, a meeting that we had at Deloitte, and she was brought by a guest, another partner at Deloitte, and we met for the first time. And probably a couple years later is when I joined the Clayman Institute Advisory Board and got to work closely with Lori. But I've learned so much from Lori, and I just continue to be impressed with not only her insights and intelligence and just passion around the advancing of women. Women's advancement is a passion for both of us. And so that was something that brought us together through the Clayman Institute, but really getting that chance to work with Lori and then keeping that relationship going. Gosh, it's got to be over 10 years now, which has just been a real highlight for me.
Thank you. It's so great to hear how you had a shared passion that really brought you two together. Lori, as the mentee, what were some areas that you needed guidance in?
Well, after I worked at the Clayman Institute, I co-founded the VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab at Stanford and was asked to join a project with the California Partners Project, which is out of the office of the first partner of California, Jennifer Siebel-Newsome. And the group wanted to think about resources that would help boards be more diverse and more inclusive. And as you know, that's a pretty big topic to cover. And so I needed support from somebody who had been both an advocate for advancing women's leadership as well as a board member to help us think about exactly the kinds of insights that would make an impact in the boardroom. So that was the most recent and maybe one of the most important projects that I've worked on with Barbara. And she was such a great advisor in so many ways. She joined us when we were formulating the idea. She helped us refine the ideas we came up with. And importantly, and maybe the most fun, when we were thinking about how to have conversations about it, Barbara joined the launch party or the launch event of this project and helped us really make it relevant to people in the space. So Barbara's helped in so many ways.
Well, for me, I've always looked at my relationship with Lori as kind of a two-way mentoring. To be honest with you, I never thought of Lori as my mentee as much as a colleague and a partner. And so, initially when I first joined the Claimant Institute board, it was new to me. I was not, familiar with the organization itself, but because of our passion around women and gender diversity, it was just really a great fit for me to be doing that in the early part of my retirement from Deloitte. But I think what I learned from Lori during those years was really just understanding the different research aspects. I've never been part of academia, so I think it was really fantastic to kind of have her insights on how to work with the research part of the Claimant Institute, and to also kind of understand, her ultimate goal of starting this leadership innovation center for women. And I really believe that, to know that I was somewhat instrumental in that was really been rewarding for me. But I always looked at our relationship as a two-way mentoring relationship. I think Lori has mentored me as much as I have mentored her.
Barbara and Lori, you've shared ways that this has been a valuable relationship for both of you. How is this mentor and mentee relationship valuable to a board? And what are some of the benefits and challenges in nurturing this relationship?
Well, maybe I could start on this one. At the board, the most challenging part is the amount of time that you're really together as a board. So if you have quarterly meetings and maybe a few calls during the year, you're not necessarily in person. And I really believe that mentoring relationships start on a very personal level, making that personal connection. And so if you're only together 4 times a year and there isn't a formal program in place to where you get connected with somebody who could be your mentor or you could be the mentee, then it's not necessarily something that comes natural and you have a way to follow up because, you're not going to see that individual for another quarter. So I think it's incredibly valuable, but not necessarily as natural as when you get to work with somebody or get to be together in person, maybe more often than every quarter. So I think that's one of the challenges. It doesn't dilute the value of the relationship, but if there's not a formal way to kind of do it, it doesn't always just happen naturally because, at least for me, walking into the room as a new board member, you don't necessarily know where to gravitate towards, and you don't necessarily know who you're going to make that connection with until probably at least 2 or 3 meetings in. So I'm a big fan of having something more structured and more formal because then it becomes part of the culture. Whereas if it's not, it's really kind of you as an individual to either reach out and find the mentor or reach out and find the mentee.
I love what you said, Barbara. When the lab joined with the California Partners Project to start this project, we interviewed dozens of directors and asked them, what makes your board culture great? What do some of the chairs do that really make your board work both pleasurable, but also really effective? And one of the things we discovered is, to Barbara's point, when there was a more formalized mentorship program, that was really effective. And what we also discovered in those conversations is that sometimes mentors don't know exactly how to be a great mentor. So, for example, they might have known people on the board already when they joined. And so that mentoring relationship was more easily established through prior relationships. Or they may not have worked with somebody who wasn't necessarily in the same role as them. So, as you know, there are many different ways people get on boards. They could be a go-to-market expert. They could be a cybersecurity expert. And so the mentor might not understand fully what that person's expertise is and how to bring that to a board. And so I like the tip that Barbara gave in her prior answer of thinking about mentorship as a two-way conversation where you're both learning about each other's expertise and how to be effective on the board. And for mentors who aren't sure what to do, that's why we put the playbook online. It's at inclusiveboards.stanford.edu. And there's some tips on how to be a good mentor. So, for example, one of the most important things we discovered in our interviews was having mentors explain the unwritten dynamics or hidden dynamics of the board, the unwritten rules. How do decisions get made? When do you weigh in? What's the best use of the board book? So those informal dynamics and really explaining it at least over the course of one business cycle, a year, is a great way for mentors to get started in thinking about how to be effective as one.
And how is a mentor-mentee relationship in a boardroom different than in other settings?
I would say that the main difference is that you're in a very structured environment in a boardroom, in a meeting. And so you've got agenda, you've got different committee meetings, and there really isn't as much time to kind of just interact personally. Whereas in other kinds of meetings, there's always much more, social interaction, I would say. There's more informality. I would say boardrooms are typically very structured and you're on a timed situation where, you're going to talk about these topics for certain minutes. And it doesn't always necessarily invite like these informal conversations where I think sometimes mentoring relationships begin. So understanding that and going in, what Lori said earlier around kind of, having a more structured approach or more structured certainly helps. But I currently serve on 3 boards, and only one of them has a formal mentoring program. So I've been in all different kinds of situations. And what I've learned works the best is to take the initiative yourself, to really either be the mentor or the mentee. If there isn't a program, volunteer with the new person that's coming on to kind of take them under your wing, show them, kind of the unwritten rules as Lori described earlier. The other fact is if there isn't a program, then don't be afraid to ask questions. And I'm a different situation where I will reach out to individual board members ahead of the meeting and just saying, hey, do you have a few minutes to chat before the meeting? I had a question on this agenda topic. What did you think? And so it can lend itself to conversations, but you have to be intentional. You can't just sit there and think it's going to happen naturally as it might be in other settings.
That's exactly what I heard in our interviews, Barbara, that building deep, trusting relationships with other board members is totally important in being effective in the boardroom. And one of the things we learned as well is that on a board, we basically have a group of peers. And that might be different than what you experience in an organization where there is, more of a distinct hierarchy. Where there's differences is how people understand how to be effective on this board, which has different dynamics than other boards, is what's the relationship with the executive team. And so to be effective in a board relationship, we learned that it's understanding how to weigh in best on topics, as Barbara said, to be curious, build relationships where you can ask those questions and take advantage of other opportunities to get to know each other. So, for example, some boards do trips to their constituents. They might go to a sales meeting. So to say yes to some of those experiences and make sure that you spend extra time with your fellow board members is another way to build the kind of relationship that enables mentorship to happen. In addition to my relationship with Barbara, I had the chance to work with Mary Baker, who has worked with YPO and is formerly a trustee of Stanford. And so when we wanted to launch what is now the lab, we went to Mary and asked her how she thought we should proceed with getting the university on board with a brand new center on women's leadership. And Mary was a remarkable mentor because she did a couple of things. In addition to advising us how to structure the ask and proposal, she used her relationship with the president to seed the idea of this center and to let us know that she told the president that alums were interested in this topic. Industry was interested in this topic. So she really laid the foundation for our work. So as a mentor, she both gave us advice, but also used her position, her relationships on our behalf. And as a result, it really helped us get off the ground.
I love that story, Lori, and I've been very blessed to have several very influential and important mentors and sponsors in my career, including at the board level. And I'd say what really kind of differentiates them is really their willingness to put a stake in the ground for me and to also give me that candid feedback that maybe I don't want to hear. It's often you can just hear, oh, you're doing fine, but then nobody really gives you any specifics. And the ones that really have helped me are the ones that say, well, you did okay, but you might consider X. And those are the ones that have really helped me navigate more effectively, whether it's throughout my career or whether in the boardroom. One specific instance is on one of the boards that I'm currently on. They had an advisory board that you have to go on for at least 2 years before you join the full board. And sometimes that period could be as long as 5 years from the time you go on the advisory committee, or it could be as short as like 1 year. So you just never know know when that spot is going to open up. And my mentor on that board was really very candid with me about how long it might take and to not get discouraged. A lot of times what you find in these situations is nobody's going to tell you you might have to wait 4 or 5 years. Instead, they might just say, oh, just be patient. We really believe in you, but they don't give you anything definitive. And you start to doubt whether or not you're really going to make it at some point, or you might start to doubt in my case. And so I really appreciated this mentor who really gave me not just reassurance, but also reasons why it was going to take so long. And it wasn't something that I could really control, which took a lot of the pressure off of me, because I thought, is it something I need to do or I'm not doing that's preventing me from going on the board sooner? And it was really just a matter of, the number of people on the board, and really had to wait for somebody to step down for me to be able to step in. So, those are the kinds of advice and recommendations that my mentor would give me that helped me along the way. But I think it's somebody who really has your back and is not afraid to give you the feedback, both positive and constructive, that you're going to need in order to be successful.
What role does mentorship play in preparing leaders for the boardroom? And what role does that mentorship also play in onboarding new directors to a board?
It turns out that you're seeing so many first-time board members today, whether it's because the board has sought to diversify their boards or they needed new expertise on their boards. And so you have today so many first-time board members. And so mentorship was really essential to so many people, because it's not necessarily that you don't know that you have expertise. The question for so many new board members is, how do I have impact with my expertise? So is it more useful to share in this way or that way? And so it's really thinking about the way you contribute to a board meeting that might be new for first-time board members especially, and in thinking about how to help them. We also heard, as you know from your NACD Blue Ribbon Report on culture, that there might be a need to reorient existing board members to the kind of culture and dynamics there are today. And so mentorship might also mean reaching out to existing board members to help them understand how to be effective in the new culture that either a new chair or the new dynamics of the board might be. And so I think of mentorship as an opportunity to ongoingly help people be effective, whether they've been on the board for a while or not.
I think you've hit a real strong point, Lori, around culture. And I agree with the NACD Blue Ribbon Report on board culture, how cultures differ. And it's the culture in the boardroom is very much a reflection of the culture in the organization. So really understanding the interaction between management and the board and management with each other will give you some insights on some of those behaviors and norms that would exist in the boardroom. And I think a mentor can really help you see those things, especially at the beginning when everything's being thrown at you. You're trying to learn and get up to speed on all the issues facing the organization. At the same time, you don't want to overstep and respect how things get done. Do people speak up all the time? Do people talk over one another? Is it one where, people say very little and it's really more around the 1 or 2 statements that you can make or contributions you can make during the course of a board meeting or a committee meeting that will be most impactful. But, I think that you really have to learn how to read that culture and understand what those norms are and what the behavioral patterns are in the boardroom before you can really assimilate into the board. And that's where a mentor, I think, can really help you, because that's one of those unwritten rules, like how do things really get done here? How do decisions get made? But what is the thought process? How much input are we allowed to give? Especially transitioning from an operator role, or you're an executive and you're serving on a board at the same time while having a full-time executive position. It can be very challenging. On one hand, your day job requires you to be in the weeds and really on top of every little detail. But in the boardroom, we're really around strategy and governance and oversight. And you have to put on a completely different hat and be really thoughtful around crossing over. So I really think when you look at boards, at least the 3 that I, have the privilege of serving on, they have completely different cultures. And yet there are a lot of similarities in the way that we all interact with each other. So, it's a lot of it is learning how to read that and understand the importance of that before really jumping in and really trying to, I guess, assimilate or become part of that board.
And in thinking about boardroom culture, what role do you see mentorship playing in fostering diversity and inclusion, whether it's that mentee that's still in management, as you mentioned, seeking their first board role, or if they're already serving on a board?
I think one of the challenges right now for the diversity inclusion space is that, and we all know this, there's really been, a lot of pushback around using that as kind of the way that you would first get appointed to a board. It's still there, but I think now it becomes very much more intentional around the things that we need to do to make sure that we're being inclusive in our behavior and the way that we interact with each other. So I think what I see, and, I've been on a board where we've gone through a lot of refreshment in the last 3 to 4 years, where there were no individuals of color before COVID, and now there are 4 individuals who are people of color and more women on the board as well. And that's been an adjustment for the existing board members. But I think the good news is that they were very intentional around, as people were terming off, to really making sure that we were desiring to have people that would bring in diverse culture, diversity of thought, diversity of experiences and skills. So I think where a mentor really can play an important role is really keeping that in the stream of consciousness. If you can really make sure that, if you're on the nominating and governance committee, that you are thinking about bringing in other individuals who bring that diversity to the board without saying, gee, we need to have more diverse people. That's really might be somewhat, especially in today's environment, there might be a little bit of pushback because it's not necessarily the way that you want to present a candidate. But if they have the skills, they have industry experience, that they have a perspective that is valuable to the board, we can bring those people in and also make sure that we're inclusive of people of color and gender and different backgrounds, because that's the way that it's more, I would say, inviting to everyone to be considering people and not just being calling out the one attribute that they might have that, is the one that makes them more diverse. And I think it's really around making sure that we're inclusive of everyone. And I think mentors play a big role in making sure that we do that with intention.
That's such a brilliant point, Barbara. That's exactly what we heard when we interviewed directors, that if they weren't clearly introduced to the board and welcomed onto the board through their full expertise, many of them got kind of locked into only answering topics of diversity and inclusion, and that doesn't serve them or serve the board. And we talked to so many organizations like Stanford Women on Boards, Ascend Pinnacle, where I know you're the lead for, Latino corporate directors. And what they all shared was that these directors are board ready, but they're just outside of the networks of traditional boards. So if boards start recruiting by asking this question, who do you know? Then they're likely going to end up with people who are within their immediate sphere of influence or network. But if instead they start with a different question, what are the skills that we'd like to bring on? How do you use that skills matrix to help diversify your board? And as Barbara said, look at diversity beyond a social identity, but to all the dimensions of expertise that somebody brings. Then not only will you strengthen your board, but when you bring somebody on the board, they won't be asked to only answer questions around diversity and inclusion. And so a really strong recruiting process, as you said, Barbara, is an essential first step to ensure boards are more effective because of the diversity of thought and lived experience people bring to them. And then mentorship can be a great way to ensure that that expertise gets really valued and shared on the board once they get on board. So it's a process. And I think at the end of the day, what we're all looking for is better decision making, better outcomes, better dynamics, and all of this plays into that at every level.
How can a strong mentor-mentee relationship lead to shifts in board discussions, decision-making, boardroom dynamics? And can you share success stories or lessons learned?
I'd like to talk a little bit about a mentee that I've had over the last couple of years on one of my boards. And this is one of the boards in which there is a formal mentoring program. And this individual was in a very different career than I was in. The individual was a physician, so had a medical background. And being on a corporate board was really completely foreign. I mean, because, you're somebody who's practicing medicine is not necessarily going to be exposed to the corporate board realm at that point in their career. So I think what really helped, I think we ended up with like at least 8 or 10 calls during the year, usually before the board meeting and after the board meeting. And I think where we got to was that she would feel very comfortable really asking me about things that were in the board book that she didn't quite understand. Where was it appropriate for her to say something? She would be able to kind of vet her own concerns privately to me first. And then I could say, well, maybe that's something you could bring up to the board. Or I could say, I don't think I would bring that up in the boardroom because that might really set something up with, other individuals, or we've already looked at that in the past and it didn't work. But that's where a mentor, I think, really can come in and kind of help shift the dynamics. And now, she's been on the board for a couple of years. We still talk at least once a quarter, love serving on the board with her. And I learned a lot about, her perspective being a medical professional, kind of what her viewpoint was on certain things that we're doing as an organization, which I was not, again, exposed to. So I think I'm back to kind of what I started with around mentoring as a two-way relationship. And I think as a mentor, I consider myself, her mentee, and what I've learned in terms of really understanding where her perspectives are coming from and seeing different points of view. And I've certainly learned so much from her as well. So I really do think it kind of changes the dynamics, and it changed her confidence level more than anything in terms of her feeling comfortable and speaking up about certain things in the boardroom, and also looking out for her, having her back and make sure that she didn't go into territory that might kind of backfire on her at a later point. So I really am so honored to play that role, but I also think it's really important as a mentor to make sure that I'm offering her the candid feedback and guidance that she should expect from me.
I love, Barbara, that you so exemplify a leader with a growth mindset and curiosity, and that you always want to learn from others and figure out how to do better because of that. And it really inspires me. When I think about board dynamics, I think about the habits boards have. Our culture really has habits as the foundation of how we experience the culture every day. And sometimes boards have habits that no longer serve them. So, for example, they might have really established their board habits when there was more similarity. Maybe it was a smaller group that had grown up with the company. And now as the company has expanded or taken on new markets or acquired new companies, the culture needs to shift. And oftentimes it's that transition from a smaller group to a larger one, or a change in marketplace that causes people to ask questions. Do our habits really support us in great decision making? Do we move too quickly towards groupthink? Do we accidentally overlook something really important because we have habits that prevent us from seeing something in the future that we really need to pay attention to? And so mentorship can play a really important role in helping the board question whether their habits really do serve them today, and how to be effective, not only in the next year, but in the future. How can we make sure we tackle issues that are outside of our individual expertise? How do we keep that learning momentum? And a couple of the ideas that were shared with us, one director came on, she was an educator, and the board wanted to expand into that space. And she saw her role not only in bringing that perspective to the board, but also helping the board through their education. And what she shared with us is that she would find articles of interest and send them to the chair, ask if they were interested in them. And if the chair was, the chair would send them to the rest of the directors. And so she really saw her role as both educating the board on the education space, but also thinking about how to have the board be more effective through education. And another mentor said she was really committed to building deep relationships, and noticed that the board tended to chit-chat only during, for example, the board dinner before the meeting. And so she suggested to the board that they have a more structured program. So at one of the board retreats, they created these cards, and the kind of instructions were to take the card, which had a number of questions like, what are you streaming now on TV? Or what's your favorite thing to do on a Saturday morning? And to walk around to 3 different directors at this retreat and ask them to answer one of the questions. And in that way, got to know other directors more deeply on a personal level. And so in many ways, mentorship, the idea of mentor-mentees, can help a board develop new habits and to learn from different kinds of expertise from each other and to build deep relationships.
Based on that, would you recommend that boards formalize a mentorship program? If so, how can they balance structure and organic relationship building? If not, what advice would you give to boards looking to improve their culture through mentorship?
Well, since I have the benefit of having both kind of experiences, both the formal and non-informal mentoring programs, I really am a big fan of having something in place. And I do think it requires the commitment of the board and the chair to really acknowledge, that this is going to help everybody. So the thing is that if you look at mentoring as a one-way street and it's only going to be there for the benefit of onboarding new people, then a lot of board members who have been on the board for 5, 6, 7, maybe even 10 years might say, well, there's really nothing in it for me. And, I had to learn the hard way. I'm not going to have time to do this. Whereas if you make it more around how it's beneficial to both the mentor and the mentee, it becomes something that then starts to get ingrained in the organization. And I would just give you an example of what the mentoring program at one of the boards I'm on, where it's actually a 2-year program for new people joining the board. And the first year, because this particular board has some medical professionals on it and some that are not, like myself, the first year you're mentored by an individual who's in kind of the similar situation. If they have a former executive and we hire a new person with audit expertise, then we put them with somebody else who's got, kind of business expertise. But the second year, they're going to be with a person with medical from the medical profession or with the medical profession, because that way you get to, again, see both sides. And I think it works beautifully. So I'm really excited because this next year I get to mentor one of the doctors on the board. And he and I have already gotten really close. And again, it's through what Lori just suggested. It was more through getting to know each other personally and getting to know about their families and not because we share the same views or the same opinions on the board. It's really through those kinds of experiences. So I think it's kind of all wrapped together if it's going to work. It's got to also be a culture in which there's a lot of encouragement around getting to know each other personally. You don't have to go on vacation together, but you certainly need to have some time where you have dinners and can talk about something other than what's on the board agenda. So if I flip this over to a board that we don't have something formal, again, then it really takes the initiative of an individual or individuals who want to reach out and actually help onboard somebody new. And when I first joined this board 2.5 years ago, 2 of the newer directors who had just joined the year before, reached out to me and say, hey, they didn't even have a formal board orientation program at the time. Now that they do, because they brought on like 4 new directors in 3 years. But it was really fun just getting to know the other 2 new directors. And they kind of took me under their wing saying, hey, we've only been on here 6 months more than you, but, let us, maybe we should all just stick together and maybe we could, kind of look out for each other. And it's really worked beautifully for that particular culture. So I think you have to really understand the board culture first, understand what works and what's not going to work, and then really kind of, design a program, whether it's formal or informal, that's going to work well within the culture where all, members kind of feel engaged either on their own or because there's something in place. So I think it comes back down to kind of the things that were fundamentally in the NACD report, and that is why culture is so critical to having an effective board and really understanding what their culture is. And this is not judgment about a good culture or bad culture. It's really assessing, understanding the culture and what's going to work within the culture so that everybody's engaged and thinks, it's going to be a very positive experience for everyone.
I love what you demonstrated, Barbara, that mentorship isn't a one-size-fit-all, either from the mentor and mentee or for any particular board. And it's really asking the question, how could we benefit from this program? One of the benefits of a formalized program is it lays out the rules. So you as a mentor or a mentee don't need to ask a question. What should we do? How do we get started? The NACD report, our board playbook has ideas of things that mentors can do. And so the more formalized it is, the less the director has to think, what should we do? And instead can build into their mentor-mentee relationship relationship building, asking questions, getting to know each other. As Barbara said, those deep relationships really do matter. And so while it's not a one size fits all, there are some advantages to either a light touch or a more formalized touch to just help people know what to expect, how to be successful at it, and then how the entire board can benefit from this kind of program.
Applying Barbara's growth mindset, and because this is an NACD hosted podcast, I need to ask, are there specific steps boards can take to foster a learning environment in which both new and seasoned directors thrive?
In terms of fostering a learning environment, I think, again, this comes down to a culture that embraces curiosity and learning and creativity to some degree. But I really think that a formal kind of stance, at least on continuing education and learning and encouraging that, is the first step in really creating that kind of environment to kind of constantly learn. So I'll give you a quick example. So we're going through on one board right now. We don't have a formal kind of professional or board development program, so that we don't necessarily encourage directors to go to NACD, or, we actually are members of NACD as an organization, but we leave it to people on their own to figure out what courses to take or how to get involved. And so we're in the process right now of kind of formalizing that more to being like, we expect you to do X hours and you can take whatever courses you want, but that becomes an expectation around, we want you to continue to grow. We want you to continue to be abreast of what's going on in governance and the best practices out there. On the other hand, some of my other boards, and I actually have talked to a number of board directors about the same situation. They really encourage, that you go to at least one conference a year, that you take courses in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. I recently went to the NACD National Summit. Actually, Laura and I were there together because we were speaking together on a panel. But, that conference, what I did with that to encourage others to do the same was I actually took a lot of notes and I put them together and I shared them with our NOM-Gov chair. And I just said, if you'd like to share this with the board, here are some of the things that I thought were fantastic at the summit, and shared it with the full board. And I got a ton of compliments and even comments like, oh, maybe I'll go next year myself. So I think you have to kind of, have an environment in which, if it's not happening or it's nothing formal, that you start to at least share knowledge between the two of you. I know that's between you and the rest of the board. And I know that one person can't do that alone, but I feel like, again, back to that intention and back to that, really being focused on what's best for the board and the organization as a whole, is to have directors that are really attuned to what's going on in the world of governance, what are the opportunities and challenges out there with emerging technology. And if you don't do those things, you're really not really being able to add the value and the expected contributions that you need to make as a board member, which is to bring that outside perspective into the boardroom and to help management as well, who is very, very busy with the day-to-day operations of the organization. They may not have time to go and get find out what other organizations are doing. And I think that's a role that board members can play, and that is much appreciated and needed by the board.
I love what you said, Barbara, because there's a few sides to this learning environment, aren't there? There's the role modeling of it, as you said, which can come from sharing your ideas and asking new questions. One of the questions we advise chairs and committee heads to ask is, what else could we do to make the meetings more effective? What's your experience on the board? And then taking those insights and using them to create a better culture for everybody. So it's role modeling definitely can lead to a more effective learning environment. And the second one is to think about whether you want to establish either rules of engagement, standards, or norms for the board. Thinking of 1 to 3 ideas that you might coalesce around to make your board more effective. And one might be the way that you want to be a learning organization, a learning team, a learning environment. And so both role modeling and then asking good questions and thinking about norms or standards are a couple of ways that boards can formalize or encourage a learning environment to help them be more effective.
I love what you said, Lori. If I could just add on a couple of other thoughts, because on one board, one of the things that we learned in our own survey was that we didn't have enough time together as a board. And I think this lends itself to a lot of the things that you raised earlier, Lori, about building trust and getting to know individual board members better. And the more time you spend as a board and not necessarily on the agenda for the board, but, and I'm not just talking about socially, but having longer executive sessions. I think one of the things that Lori's aware that we do this on one of the boards is we actually have a pre-executive session before we even start the board meeting, where we really talk about the things that we found on the in the board book that we might have more questions about. And the way that we kind of get to the inclusion part of this for this particular board is our board chair actually kind of makes assignments and said, well, Sally, maybe you want to bring that up in the board meeting, or why don't you take on that point you just made in here? I think that would be a good one. And that's another way of making sure that all voices are heard. So I think the road to becoming kind of a learning organization is exactly what Lori said around, role modeling and really being intentional. But at the same time, you can change a culture by just creating space and creating opportunities for people to speak up and showing the value of the knowledge that they can bring to the table. So by having these pre-executive sessions with just the board and then a post-executive session, which is obviously more traditional to kind of debrief after the board meeting without the members of management present, it really helps to get the board to be more of a closely engaged and working group together. I found it to be really effective in terms of building that relationship, as well as having that safe zone to where you could really talk about what's on your mind.
Barbara, I've learned so much from you, and thank you for sharing those specific ideas, because I'm going to take them.
I'm so flattered. I've learned so much from you, so that means a lot. Yeah, thank you, Lori. Thank you, Barbara. I feel like a lot of us learned a lot today. And I actually want to appreciate you all for taking the time to talk with us and for that role modeling and being intentional and sharing those insights for all of NACD.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. We obviously, we're big fans of NACD and what you're doing out there to help all of us become more effective in the boardroom. So thank you for everything you do.
Exactly. I so appreciate your focus on culture at NACD. And I think together we can help boards be more inclusive and effective.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit NACDonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship magazine. That's NACDonline.org. Thank you for listening.